Speaker, Dawn Whitehead. She's Senior Director of
Global Learning
and Curricular Change at the Association of American Colleges and Universities. And we look forward to what we have to say.
Your shoulders will lie.
I'm going to move.
Okay.
Thank you. And I am. Okay. Oh, okay. Thank you. All right. And at times I'm technologically challenged, so I will. Maybe this isn't turned. Okay, it's not on. Okay, that's the first thing that's important. All right. Okay. So thank you, Mark. And similar to Richard, I'll tell you a quick bit about my organization, AAC&U, and who I am, and then I'll give some other examples throughout the talk for the rest of the evening. So first of all, raise your hand if you are familiar with AAC&U. Okay, very good. Then I can give the very quick rundown. So of course, AAC&U, we are a member-based organization. We have about 1,350 member institutions. And we have institutions that are 2-year, 4-year, public, private, highly selective, open access. We run the gamut of institutional membership. And the two missions that we have, one is to help institutions provide a high quality liberal education for all students, regardless of their disciplines, regardless of majors. And second is to help ensure that institutions believe and implement inclusive excellence so that they're figuring out ways to make sure that students have opportunities to excellence across the board. Secondly, as Mark said, I'm Dawn Michelle Whitehead, and by training I'm an Africanist and an international and comparative educator. And my background, primarily, I have done a lot of work in West Africa and Ghana, a bit in Liberia, and quite a bit of work in Kenya as part of an institutional partnership and some of my own work. I also, like Richard, have done some work in the area of global service learning, and I'll share a few of those examples as we're talking about some of the topics tonight. So the four things I want to say, and I know you'll say, he said we had to be out by 8:45. My students would always say this to me. They'd say, you always have too many things, but we're going to touch on some issues, and I hope during the Q&A we can get deeper on some of the topics that I'm going to mention. So I'd like to start by sharing some of the challenges that we've had as a field in defining global learning and what that actually means. Then I'd like to give some examples of the guiding dimensions of global learning, which help ensure that students are having a high-quality experience. Talk a little bit about what global learners can do, and then I'll end with the power behind global learning is what we can do to make global learning a high-impact practice. So first I'll start with a story that many of you have heard, and it is the story of the blind men and the elephant. The origins, of course, are in India, but many, many different iterations have been told in many parts of the world. And so the story begins with, once upon a time, there was a village, and there were 6 blind men in the village. One day, someone came up to them and told them that there was an elephant in the village that day. And the 6 men said, we don't know what an elephant is. We want to get there and try to figure out what an elephant is. So they made their way to the elephant. The first man grabs the tail of the elephant, and he says, oh, the elephant is a rope. The second man grabs the hind leg of the elephant, and he says, oh, the elephant is like a tree. It's a tree. The third man goes to the belly of the elephant and says, oh, the elephant is like a wall. The next man climbs up and feels the ear and says, oh, the elephant is like a huge hand fan. Another man goes to the front, grabs the trunk, and says, oh, the elephant is a tree branch. The final man goes and carefully somehow touches the tusk and says the elephant is a spear. Now they all start to argue because what they felt is what they felt. And they start to argue about this, and a wise man walks by and says, "Excuse me, gentlemen, what are you arguing about? What's going on?" And they said, "We have all felt and touched the elephant, but someone isn't telling the truth. I know what I felt. I know what." And the man says, "Gentlemen, you are actually all correct. You have all felt different, isolated parts of the elephant, but you are right. What you have described, but on the whole, that makes the elephant." And as someone in the field of international education, I sometimes feel as if international education and global learning is a little bit like the elephant. And depending on who you talk to, they feel that they know what global learning is. So you can see from these images, these are all images of global learning that have been taken by students in local contexts and in contexts outside the country, and they all represent aspects of global learning. However, if you were to ask individuals, they may say, "Oh no, study abroad, that's the only global learning." Someone else may say, "Global service learning, that's the only global learning." In fact, I have a colleague who was an anthropologist, and when she went to a new institution and she was telling them about her work with a small community in rural Guatemala, someone on campus said, "Oh, you know, that's not global learning, that's area studies." And Hillary thought, okay. So it's something that as a field we've had to wrestle with, and we've had to have discussions and come together to figure out what we're talking about. Furthermore, when you hear what people are saying on campuses, they talk about global perspective, as we're talking about this weekend, global citizenship, intercultural competence, intercultural knowledge, international education. These are all things that people say when they're talking about what we now and what I'll describe as global learning. Now, part of it is because of the origin of our field and from whence we've come. And so, of course, originally the field was called international education. This is out of the post-World War II period when area studies was developed, peace studies, development studies, and this was to increase understanding among nations. In the 1980s, you start seeing elements of what is now called internationalization, a term that Jane Knight has made famous, where you're talking about infusing an international dimension into the mission of the institution, the teaching, the research, and the service aspects. And then you have a number of folks talking about global citizenship, which is what we've been talking about here, and how are we preparing students to understand and to be national citizens and to be citizens of the world. And then you have global perspectives. How are students able to understand and learn from one another to be part of these pluralistic societies? Another element that many of us have spent time talking about in some of the sessions is this concept of intercultural competence. And how is it that our students can make appropriate and effective interactions when they're engaging with people who are different. And at the end, we have come to use the term global learning to describe what's going on in the curricular and the co-curricular. But another thing that's important for us to consider is that global learning has evolved and developed as the perception, the public perception of higher education has also evolved. And this is a colleague of mine from the Gates Foundation shared this image with me when we were doing some work together at Goucher College. And she argues that in the pre-World War II period, higher education was perceived as a luxury. It was something that only a few people could obtain. After World War II, the perception changed and it was seen as a privilege. In the 1960s, it shifted to be an opportunity. And then in the 1990s, it was seen as a necessity. And in 2009, it emerged as a right. And I often say, well, what about global learning? And at this meeting, what about CLAC? Where does that fit on the perception of the value? Is global learning a luxury? Some would say yes. Is it a necessity? Many of us would say yes, it's a necessity for where we want our students to be and what the students are going to deal with. When we look at the types of jobs students are going to have, it doesn't matter if they are going to live outside the borders of the US. The companies that they will be working for may have customers, suppliers, or locations that are in other parts of the world, and the students need to be able to engage with people. Another example, when we look at the accreditors, and we look at ABET for engineering, we look at the business accreditors, we look at the accreditors for nursing, and you see that there are intercultural and or global connections in their competencies. Lastly, and this was talked about a little bit earlier, most institutions list global in their missions, but what does it really mean? Are they really asking students to do something, or are they just saying international or global as a part of the mission? For that, I want to share, and many of you have seen this, I'll share two documents with you. So one, okay, the first is a document that many of you have seen, and I'm not showing it to you to talk about assessment right now. I'm sharing this document so that you have the definition of global learning that a number of institutions have developed with us. So at AAC&U, we had a project called Shared Futures, and the focus was on integrating global learning across the general education curriculum as well as into the majors. And so over about a 15-year period, there were about 51 institutions who formally worked with us and many other institutions that were part of the initiative as well. And it was in response to these institutions that this particular definition of global learning was developed. Again, when we developed this definition, well, first of all, how many of you know why AAC&U formed the value rubrics broadly? Does anybody know why we created these rubrics? Okay, so the rubrics were created in response to a fear, and this came up in one of the other sessions this morning, to a fear that the Department of Education was going to create some sort of one-time exam for college students, much like what's happening at the state level in many places. So many of our member institutions came to AAC&U and said, what can we do to make sure that they aren't the ones that decide what students should know? And the idea came about to develop value rubrics, and you'll see there are 16 rubrics that AAC&U has created, from critical thinking to written communication, quantitative literacy, etc., and I can share more information about that a bit later. Global learning was developed later as a part, as I said, of the Shared Futures Initiative, and so the idea is that you can use work that your students are already completing to score on the rubrics. So the idea is there isn't going to be some special test, some special exam, but there's something that you as a faculty member have designed for students to do that can measure student learning. So again, when we developed the global learning rubric, it was critical that we had an interdisciplinary team of people who created the rubric. So there were folks from all different disciplines. There were faculty, there were staff, there were student affairs professionals, there were administrators who were involved in this lengthy process to develop the rubric. And the reason I've given it to you is so you don't have to write down the definition if you wanted to see it or if you weren't in Tim's session earlier. If you take a look, you can see that the definition on the backside, without the grid, is that global learning is a critical analysis of and engagement with complex, interdependent global systems and legacies and their implications for people's lives and the Earth's sustainability. So this definition is a definition that can be used in any particular discipline, any particular course, any background. It's not meant to take the place of a content definition. It's meant to be laid on top of the content that is being taught in the course. In most cases, what I do when I'm visiting campuses and what folks do when they contact me is we talk about how do you make this definition relevant for your campus. So of the 51 institutions that I've mentioned, I would say about a third have created their own definitions or modified this definition, and that is completely fine with us. Our idea is for the rubric and the definition to be used in a way that's meaningful in your institutional context. So the other thing that's important is looking at the global learning outcomes that are a part of this rubric. The first is that we want students to become informed, open-minded, and responsible people who are attentive to diversity across the spectrum of differences. So that's one of the first outcomes, that we think global learners should be able to demonstrate this. Secondly, they should seek to understand how their actions affect both the local and the global community. So again, it's not just about what's happening out there, if you will, it's about what's happening all over. And last, it's so that students can address the world's most pressing and enduring issues collaboratively and equitably. Now, it's also important to know that we have worked with language faculty across the country as well, and faculty that are working in cultural studies, as well as a few examples with CLAC, to look at how these definitions relate to language, because language was intentionally not included in the rubric. Because again, it was meant to lay across any discipline or any design, and there was fear that, well, what about the fields where language is not a possibility? We had some engineering folks who said, that's not something that we're ever going to be able to do, knowing how the number of credit hours our students have to take. And so what we have seen, and some of our language colleagues have done, some of our culture colleagues,
is they have looked at the outcomes and they've talked about ways in which languages and cultures are critical. In order to be attentive to diversity across the spectrum of difference, you have to engage and you have to communicate with people. And that can come using language and cultural knowledge. Another one, seeking to understand how your actions affect the local and global, you must observe, you must listen, you must speak. So language and culture matter there. And lastly, addressing the world's most pressing issues, we would never advocate that an issue can be solved by a single person from a single country. You would need to work together. I'm sure many of you saw the most recent Nobel winner in chemistry, and there were 3 people from 3 different countries who built on the work that each had done, their predecessors had done. And so again, that shows why it's critical that students are seeing and thinking outside just their home institution. So there are 5 principles that guide global learning, and these again are principles that we've worked with our institutional members to develop. The first is that students should have meaningful opportunities to analyze and explore complex challenges across the curriculum. Students, like CLAC, should have more than one experience. The idea is that it's nice if you can have a global or international studies course, but students need many opportunities to engage with these experiences and these challenges. They should have experiences in different courses. They should have experiences on and off campus. Secondly, students should be able to apply their learning and take action, responsible action. So this definition in our perspective on global learning is that it goes beyond knowledge and it goes to action. What is it that students are empowered to do? How are they able to evaluate the situation before they get involved? And how are they able to make decisions? Third, global learning should enhance students' sense of identity. I believe Richard talked about this earlier. You learn more about yourself when you're engaging in service and global service learning and other activities. And so it should help students to enhance their identity, their sense of their communities, their sense of ethics, and their ability to perspective take. They'll learn just as much, as I said before, about themselves as they're learning about their other communities in which they're working. Fourth, it's critical that they have opportunities to collaborate respectfully with diverse others. Employers have talked about the value of this, the disciplines have talked about the value of this, and they want students, before they are entering the field, before they are entering medical school, before they're entering nursing school, before they're entering classrooms and social work environments, they want students to have experience collaborating with diverse others. Not just saying we worked in a group in class, but that they actually came together and solved a problem or attempted to solve a problem. And finally, it's really important that students see the world as a collection of interdependent yet inequitable systems. And students should understand the role that higher education plays in expanding their knowledge of privilege and stratification, sustainability and development, and to help foster individuals' abilities to advance equity both at home and abroad. So if you see on the back of the rubric, and I won't spend much time on this, there are 6 dimensions of the rubric, and again, these were all agreed upon by the interdisciplinary teams that developed it, and we can talk about this a little bit further during the question and answers. Okay, so now that we have defined global learning, we've looked at the outcomes, we've looked at the key dimensions, let's talk a little bit about global learning. And many of the examples of activities that you see on the board, I've heard you talk about over the course of today and today's meeting. As I mentioned before, study abroad is a critical part of global learning, but it's not the only part. And as we are encouraging equitable access for all students, we have to think critically about ways to provide students with opportunities to engage in global learning, since across the USA, only about 10% of students participate in credit-bearing study abroad programs. So that means we have to look at the other ways, such as the interactive video conferencing. And when you have a course using COIL or interactive video conferencing, what else are students doing outside the classroom to connect, not just the time in the classroom when they're connecting with the class, but how do you have them engaging with students from those cultural environments offline? I know with my students in particular, I've taught several interactive video courses. One I taught with the University of Tehran in Iran, and then I taught another one most recently with a university in Indonesia, in Yogyakarta, Gajah Mada. And I started including requirements if you needed to Skype with your partner X number of times, you needed to do an interview, you needed to do this, that, or the other. And the students were doing much, much more than I asked them to do because they were so excited and engaged in this. So in close with that part, I'd like to say that like CLAC, global learning should be action-oriented, informed by culture and relationship building. It should be scaffolded over the course of the student's educational experiences, and it should be transformative, and it has to be a part of lifelong learning. Students are always going to develop these skills. But global learning is not magical. I know some people think it is. There's something just about engagement, but there's more. If you look at the second document I gave you where it says high impact practices, this is a very important component, and many of you have been looking at some of these issues already, and this may be something you can share with your colleagues. But high impact practices become high impact when certain conditions are met. And this is a document that we worked on with George Koo, of course, to look at how can these experiences become high impact, as I said. And again, I think someone mentioned earlier, what about pairing high impact practices? Are there opportunities where students experience more than one over the course of their educational experience? And there are, and I'm happy to give some examples of those. One I'd like to highlight is that students must invest a significant amount of time and effort in order for a practice to become high impact. It's great if there's a day of service activity, but that is not going to make the course high impact because they spent one day doing a Martin Luther King Day of Service or something like that. If students are participating in these kinds of activities, they need to participate with the community members on multiple occasions. They need to receive feedback and have discussions that connect what's going on in the classroom with that experience, and it's something that takes time. Secondly, regarding the feedback, going a little bit deeper, if a student is engaged in a study away experience, let's say students are coming, one example, I've been working with a couple of campuses from an Appalachian college, and there's the Appalachian College Association, so these are colleges in Appalachia, and they've been working with some historically black colleges and universities, and so they've been doing study aways, where students do a research day on one campus, and they go to industries and other things to see how global is alive. For example, a group came from a small town in Kentucky, spent time at Clark Atlanta, visited Coke, and visited a couple of other companies, and then they went down to the other community and they learned about agricultural development and other factors. But students have to receive constant and consistent feedback when they do these kinds of things. So as they're developing their perceptions and their ideas, that you're able to help them and help them develop and to think clearly about what they're seeing. And the feedback can't come just at the end of the program, it has to come throughout the experience. Another issue that's really important is that students should have interaction with both their faculty and their peers about substantive matters. It's great if your students want to talk to you about the new local restaurant they went to that has an international flavor, but you really need to make sure that you are discussing the difficult topics that are coming up during students' experiences, either locally or globally. They need to have that space where they can talk things through with the faculty member and talk things through with their peers. The other thing that's important is that there should be periodic structured opportunities to reflect and integrate learning. And students must make connections between the course readings, their experiences, and other community activities that they're doing. This can come in both written and verbal forms. One example in one of my courses was we had a sister arrangement with a university in Kenya. It was a pretty large project with their medical school and our medical school. We've been working in Kenya for 25 years, and we started adding service learning. We started adding other experiences. Initially, we just had medical students, medical residents. We started having students from the liberal arts come. We started having public health and others. And there was in 2006, most of you are familiar, there was horrific post-election violence in Kenya. And one of the things that we of course stayed in touch with our colleagues because, as Richard mentioned this morning, it's about relationships. So we canceled the program one summer and then we went the following summer because it was not a time for us to be there. It was a time for healing in the community. But before we went, the students were very familiar. They'd read a book called It's Our Turn to Eat, which talked about the history of Kenya, talked a bit about some corruption, talked about the allocation of land once the British left. And they also had lectures by our Kenyan colleagues at the university. So they had lectures before they left, They heard from different voices of people in Kenya, and then when they were placed at their service sites, they also heard about this experience. Some of them worked at a farm, others worked in a school, and almost everyone had someone tell a personal account of the story, and the students were aware. And the students were able to make connections in their writing and in their conversations that they knew about this significant event in Kenya, and they didn't just come without being prepared. Finally, I think I'll skip down to the importance of making sure that your students have experience with diversity, unfamiliar people, and circumstances. As they embark on these global learning activities, they should work with people whose backgrounds are different, as I said before, but they have to do this with preparation. A couple of us kind of joked a little bit about Ryan Lochte. I don't know if you're familiar with him, the swimmer, and we said if he would have come through one of our institutions, he would have been prepared, we hope. He would have understood the cultural context and some of the things that he was going through. And so it's important that before we send students to environments that are different and are unfamiliar, that we actually prepare them for these experiences, which is indeed critical. So one of the most important things that we talk about in the field of global learning, and I've heard you talk about this in CLAC, is that global learning cannot be achieved in a single course or a single experience. It's acquired cumulatively across the student's entire career. And that's one area where we have worked hard to help institutions add global elements. So one of the good ways that we have seen institutions, individuals, faculty, instructors, as well as student affairs, is to consider the grand global challenges that are the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Now, previously, the Millennium Development Goals seemed more focused on the challenges that were facing low-income countries, but with the new goals that came out about a year ago, they're issues that all countries face. All countries have issues of poverty, of hunger, of access to education, of healthcare, and they require different majors and different ideas and disciplines to solve the problems. The first one, when you talk about the issue of global poverty, it's not something that affects, as I said, just one discipline. You need economists, you need social workers, anthropologists, educators, public affairs professionals, and many, many others. And the key for our students is that they can learn from other countries and communities that are attempting to alleviate poverty. When I taught, I was always very, very careful to make sure that my students' first experience or first formal institutionalized experience with poverty was not in sub-Saharan Africa, it wasn't in Southeast Asia, it wasn't in Latin America, it was in our local community. So they could understand poverty locally and understand poverty globally. We also made sure to realize that poverty isn't associated with a particular ethnic group or an individual, and we looked at the systemic factors that contribute to poverty. I'll also never forget the disbelief on about a handful of my Ghanaian students, and I was working with some students in Accra, and I talked about in the state of Indiana that there was a high percentage of students who received free or reduced lunch. And some of the students there said, oh, that can't be true. That can't be true. And then there were others who were Ghanaian students who were very well traveled who said, oh yes, I've seen poverty in the US. And having that type of dialogue about the diversity both in the US and the diversity in the Ghanaian context was extremely helpful. When we think about issues of health inequality or health challenges, I had the pleasure of hearing Paul Farmer speak last week, and he talks about global health equity. You know, it's again critical that you've got a wide range of people who are involved. When you think about the challenge of the Zika virus, I've got a great deal of family in South Florida, and now there's a red zone in Miami where you should not go if you were expecting. And we think about how originally we thought, oh, it's just in Brazil, it's just in Venezuela, it's just in Puerto Rico, and seeing how it has spread and seeing who has to be involved. One issue that's come up lately that involves more than just physicians in the Miami area is if someone's spouse wants to be tested for Zika, there hasn't really been funding allocated for that. So who's going to pay for it? Will your insurance cover it when it won't? Will it won't? There are a lot of factors that play in these global health issues. So finally, I'd just like to reiterate the importance of focusing on the big questions that are facing our local communities and the world when we think about global learning, and giving students an opportunity to pull together what they have learned in their courses, in their history courses, in their anthropology courses, in their education courses, in their chemistry courses, as they are attempting to engage with the problems that face the world. This will allow them to see themselves as a local citizen, as a national citizen, and as a global citizen. Now, I'd like to close with two of my favorite tennis players, and I don't know if this is intentional or unintentional, but I have found that Rafael Nadal and Serena Williams have actually epitomized global learning when you look at what they have done and what they've become. So for those of you that don't follow tennis, Rafael Nadal is probably the greatest clay court tennis player in history. He's from Mallorca, Spain, but in order to become great, he's been world number one. He had to leave Spain in order to be number one. You can't be the world's best if you don't leave your home. Same thing, Serena Williams, born in Michigan, raised in California. Some would argue she is the greatest female player of all time. She tied Steffi Graf back in the summer with 22 majors. But again, Serena had to leave California to become number one in the world and to become this player. But both of these people were willing to leave their homes. They were willing to go to work and interact with people who were different from themselves. They were willing to learn the cultures and languages of different people. Both of them are multilingual. Both of them spend large parts of the year in other parts of the world intentionally, not just traveling, but they spend significant time in other parts of the world. And both of them have been engaged in problem solving in challenges that affect and impact their local and global communities. Rafa's done a lot in Spain. Serena has created a tennis center in Southeast, in Washington, D.C., as well as in South Africa. And so to me, they embody what we want global learners and what we want CLAC students to do and prepare them to engage the world. So with that, I'd like to start some discussion if you have questions.
I absolutely love your talk. I have to say that. But I do wonder about one thing that you mentioned. You mentioned that you make a point of teaching your students in America about poverty. And I wonder how you bridge teaching students about poverty in America with learning about poverty that is, I mean, uncomparable to any American poverty. I'm just wondering how you build that bridge for your students.
Absolutely, much like when I'm teaching students about the healthcare system. And if they're going to an area where the healthcare system is low resource, and some of my colleagues from the medical school, nursing school have worked with our students in rural communities where they have seen very low resource facilities in the US as well as internationally. I think the key is I focus on poverty if I know my students have a perception that the location where we are going is poor, if you will. We also talk about the difference between poverty in different settings, and we talk about what does it mean to be, what does poverty mean? What are you able to do? How do you differentiate the two? But I think you have to have them unpack what's going on here. Because I do remember one time when I had a student, and this is when I thought I had failed. I had a student who we were going to rural Ghana, and we started to see the stereotypical and the traditional rural huts. And a student said, "Oh, we've finally seen the real Africa." Now, this is after we had been in the country for several weeks. They had been paired with a mentor at a local school. They had been to their folks' homes, and they still struggle to understand diversity in that context. So I think I'm very careful in how I would explain poverty to them, but they have to realize the diversity at home, because a lot of times our students will get it abroad, and they're very comfortable talking about, oh, they have this and this, but they don't want to put the mirror back on what's happening on our own campuses. And so that's why I think it's important. But I think it's much like when you talk about political systems and political development, you talk about it in the cultural context in which it is.
I wanted to run with that ball a little bit more because for those of us that work with education,
Yes.
international education in the global, dealing with the global South, my I work with many colleagues who work with Africa, including my wife, and I work on Latin America and Asia. And one thing I've seen again and again is the kind of bounce back factor with the Global South. Essentially, even if they like their experience, and I've never had a student in Brazil that didn't love the experience, but that sense of like, oh my God, I'm glad I'm not there. And that seems like a really, and if you add on top of that, you know, particularly the, you know, white global north heroism vis-a-vis the global south.
Oh, yes.
You know, which is sort of the only way, in other words, the only way to kind of like deal with being in the global south is to be heroic. And fix it, save it, you know, we know the
Yes.
right?
Oh, yes.
So I guess my question for you is that within the context of CLAC, you know, how can we kind of deal with that, what I'm calling the bounce back with the global south and poverty?
I think a lot of it is how students are prepared and the type of engagement they have in the communities. So I'll give a quick example, and I'll use the medical school, then I'll give a less medical example. But one of the things that we learned from our medical school, and as I mentioned, we had the partnership with Moi University in Kenya, and we have people who are on the ground there 24 hours, or 20, you know, all year long, they're always there. And we have very, very strict preparation for those that go, and in that orientation, the discussion of being the savior is discussed. There are articles that raise that very issue. And we talked to students, and once we started taking non-medical students, and I was doing more with the programs, we talked to them about, even though the community may perceive you, someone in the community may perceive you as a savior, you are not. And you let them know, I'm a student, I'm here to learn from you. And it takes time for students to get that, but it also takes time to build the relationships on the ground where students can have equal relationships. I'll give a quick example from Ghana. So I've been working in Ghana for almost 20 years. And I remember one of the first times I went, when I got to the school, they had been told by the Minister of Education I was coming. And so they said, oh, the big lady is here. She needs the best chair. So as soon as every room I went to, someone would get the big, and I would say, no, I'm not going to sit, you know, I can stand. No, you have to sit down. And it was a matter of being respectful. But over time, the more I worked with the same communities, they understood my perspective in coming in was not to cause confusion, was not to be disruptive, and I wanted to observe for a while, and then I wanted to get involved. And so as I developed my personal relationships with my partners on the ground, they had a better understanding of what I wanted and what I needed and what my students needed. So back to the medical example, Bob Eintertz has written an article, and I think there are 4 or 5 authors, and they've looked at the impact of this program for over the past 20 years and the perceptions of students, and you don't see the bounce back as much in that article, and I'm happy to share that. And I think it's all about the time they spend on the ground, the relationships that are developed, and what they're actually doing that can help with that. There's also some literature in teacher education on students who have worked, and I've done a bit of work there with the Navajo community. And it was a similar perception originally. They're like, oh, I'm so glad I'm not here. But then they were like, oh, no, I do want to be here, and I want to learn more, and I want to be here longer. So I think, to me, it's all about the preparation. And I think, as Richard said this morning, it's all about what do you do when they get back? How are you able to keep them together? How are you able to keep that spirit alive and to help them continue to be engaged with those communities even when they're home?
Well, if I could just add on to one of the issues is if they never go, too. So, you know, if their experience is only on campus, even if they visit a local community, and they may even reject the opportunity to go abroad because of this fear of, you know, I've seen what it's like there. I don't want to, you know. So I just wanted to go back to Gastonia, North Carolina.
Yeah, oh yes, I had students, well, and then too the fear, when Ebola broke out, I was taking students to Swaziland. And Swaziland, of course, is in southern Africa. And I had students saying, oh, you know, I don't think I'm going to be able to go because, you know, Ebola. And I said, well, let's look at the map, you know, and let's look at how the disease is transmitted. And is it like, you know, I said, now, if that was in, you know, California, how likely or how many days would it take to get here? So I think it's really, we have to prepare them, and we can, have those kinds of discussions. Yes?
In this example, you're talking about U.S. students going out.
Yes.
But talking to international students
Coming in?
they're scared as hell.
That's a whole nother, yes.
Right, about gun violence?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And they're asking questions, and this kind of goes back to one of the presentations I heard earlier about how you prepare the site.
Yes.
It would be really interesting for our students to read and analyze what they're being told about the incoming students.
Mm-hmm.
Just like it would be, and I don't know how much of a voice thus far in the presentations today, I haven't heard much about the international student coming in.
Mm-hmm.
Not that those students don't also go out again, right,
Right.
in our study abroad. But they're having those same kinds of attitudes.
I think so, and especially I think it was it last month or a couple of months ago, one of the airline magazines and with one of the Chinese characters, said in London and in the U.S. avoid black communities because they're very dangerous. And then I think it was last week there was something went out to some African nations saying, be careful, if you are a black African, be careful, because in the U.S. you never know what is going to happen to, there's, a lot of people have been harmed by the police and other things. So I think you're right, we have to really be careful and we have to prepare students for the realities. One thing that happened, there were a couple of campuses that I worked with, and I don't know if this was reassuring to the international students or it just frightened them, but they worked with the local police, the campus police, to do a video for how to interact with police. Now, some people say, why do we have to do that? And that's just respectability, politics, that kind of thing. But it was a teachable moment for that International Affairs Office to talk to them about, okay, when you're working with students from certain parts of the world, we have a large number of Saudi students, and you may make assumptions about them. Here's what we have learned by working with our students. Again, not representing the whole culture or the whole country, but saying this is what we have learned on our campus about working with these students. So I think that some people have done things like that, but you're right, that's an area that's underdeveloped, and we definitely need to do more to prepare students for the realities when they get here.
The student basically said to the president, and they weren't able to navigate the English well enough to be, the statement was basically like, we know you all have guns,
Mm-hmm.
and if I have a disagreement with somebody, am I going to get shot?
Mm-hmm.
Direct question.
Yeah.
And he was kind of caught off guard.
Yeah.
But if that student was so brave, right, to ask that question, what are the other questions they have?
Right.
And especially this recent Inside Higher Ed article about the rhetoric here,
Mm-hmm.
about immigrants and
Right, and
others.
open carry on campuses, which some students have been, I saw two hands.
On that note, something that's really helped me personally is when there's a speaker on campus that is from Honduras, or I recently made someone from Honduras. I invite them to class, and I've been really lucky the fact that this semester I've had a couple of speakers already. But the students are they ask very detailed questions, and the person is very honest. And the person from Honduras specifically said, before I came here, I hate Americans. He said that flat out to my class, and I thought, oh, people will I'm going to do this. But he entered, I talked to Mark that same day, too, so he flat out said he hated Americans. But the next day I came and we talked, and then they said, I did the tour, now I know that you're not what I thought you were.
Right.
Anyway, we took it as a teachable moment, and I told him, we might not agree with what he had to say, but it's important for us to learn what it's like, what people think of us outside of here.
Right. Before we go back, one other quick thing. I know some campuses have done, they use social media in the recruitment process, and so the students are assigned a mentor or someone like that. So before they even come, they're communicating with students, and they can hopefully convey some of those, address some of those questions. In the back, in the mark.
YouTube has movies from Bolivia, and there's also equal access in English to this movie called Sexual Dependencies. Dependency of sexual. It is absolutely worth watch it before you show it to any students, because it's about rape and stuff like that. But it starts of a rape victim in Bolivia, and it ends up with African American women in the United States. It ties it together. There's like vagina dialogues, like 5, 6 stories, of these victims who then become survivors. But Bolivia is making super cool consciousness raising movies. They're high quality coming out of Bolivia. So that's just super cool movie. So, but it's hard. It's the real thing. Okay? So it's a must watch.
Thank you.
I just wanted to mention that there is actually an article that's come out in the last year. I'll have to track down the citation and share it with you. It's what about various state departments around the world tell their tourists and students what they need to know before they come to the U.S. It's very enlightening. My students in intercultural communication read it, and they're pretty surprised.
You mentioned the Navajo, our carriage is turning into a
Last call.
The Navajo Nation, I'm sorry, yeah.
So I've been in discussions with a professor of anthropology at Cornell who teaches in the American Indian program, and I wanted to work with him to set up a CLAC, but we don't have the numbers within the parent course to do it. So I wondered, since you have this broad view of education across the U.S., have you seen other models? I'd like to provide some support for students who are trying to study Native American language on campus, but there just aren't that many speakers. So do you have any alternative models or any? I just would like to brainstorm with you a little.
Okay, yeah, there are a handful that are doing interactive video conferencing across institutions. I know Indiana University offers, there are a couple of people here from Indiana. How many they offer a tremendous number of world languages and cultures. And I know that for a while they were offering Dene or Navajo, and so they were doing some video conferencing for other institutions that were interested. So that's been the main thing I've seen, or some that have been a part. This takes a really savvy student, and this is not for everyone, but students that are institutions that have been a part of the National Student Exchange Program, where students may go for a year or a semester. They pay their home tuition, and then they go to another institution that's in a different region or significantly different, and they can go there for a year and do language. Very few students do it, but that's one thing that I've observed. But I've really only seen the technology piece, or institutions like within the same city where you have multiple institutions and there's been some partnering. There have been a couple I've seen that have done that with Kiswahili. I don't know if Duke has done anything with Kiswahili. I don't know.
Going to.
Okay, all right, because I was thinking.
UNC's doing a lot.
Okay,
We've done some sharing of
Consortium.
We've done some sharing of video conferencing.
But yeah, that's the main thing I've seen.
I'm sorry?
Yeah, that's the main thing I've seen.
Yeah, well, thanks so much.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was thinking about your comment about why language was deliberately left out of the rubric for global learning. And as you said it made sense to me.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure I would necessarily, be willing to agree that these majors that have all these requirements that exclude language should be able to get away with that. But
I agree.
The other piece of this, though, is I wonder if there's a different sort of rubric that we ought to be thinking of, maybe something like polylingual learning, or something that sort of makes normal the idea that you ought to be, engaging different languages rather than just one. Whereas it seems the problem with the global learning excluding language is it sort of makes it normal that English is sufficient.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, nobody in this room really thinks that. So I'm wondering, is there another way to get at that with another kind of rubric if you really can't include it in the global learning list?
Right, thank you, that's a good idea. And I think I shared with you earlier where we have a survey that's out now to work, to get examples of how people have modified the rubric. And that's something that we've had our eye on because, we feel the same way. I've worked with enough engineering folks that do have students doing 2+2 programs. So there is some interest. It's just not all the students in the schools of engineering, but they see the value of it. And so that's one thing we were hoping that we would get is someone who has done some modification where language was explicitly included. But I'll think about that because I think you're right. It can be more explicit. And I think that's one of the things that we'll look forward to is to seeing how people have made it more explicit or sharing what you've created in your project. Okay, in the back,
yes. You mentioned that there's only about 10% of all U.S. students who get to credit-based study abroad programs. Why do you think that is? Why is that number so low?
Yeah, there are a lot of factors, and finance is always brought up as one of the most important, and for many students it is. But it's also about what parents and what students believe is required, or is what is part of the educational experience. There was a study, I can't remember the source, I'll find it, that looked at middle class and upper class African American students whose parents were college educated. And they found that even in this group that could easily have afforded to send their students abroad, they didn't, because they didn't see it as a part of the college experience. I think we can look at small models like the honors colleges that are offering stipends for students to go abroad, and you can see that more students go because that money is made available. But it's all about the culture too. You know, I've worked with some institutions where from the moment students come in, when they go to orientation, you're socialized to fight for whatever your mascot is and to go abroad. And so I think when it becomes normalized and it becomes part of the expected curriculum, you see changes, but finance is definitely a part of it. And then the value in the major, there are some majors where they say, oh, our students don't need to go abroad. They have everything here. So it has to be a real culture change at the institution to get those numbers up. And also some argue we should include, or Open Doors as the data source, some say they should include the non-credit bearing and see what that number actually looks like, because they're only looking at the ones where credit is offered.
And we don't include National Student Exchange in that.
Right, no. Mm-mm. You have been so kind. I thought you would have been like, all right, no. Enough, no. But thank you so much.
I think we all agree both of our keynote speakers have been excellent today. Give them